This announcement from Nigel Farage came yesterday. We get used to it. We get notice in advance. There's going to be a reform announcement sometime around 11 o'clock, usually on a Monday morning, and they're usually pretty big. Lots of focus on Palestinian state recognition yesterday, though, but much more detail emerging after the press conference that went on. Quite a tetchy performance from Nigel Farage being asked. It's very funny, isn't it, how journalists are very keen on detail about all of reform's policies, care remarkably little about the detail of the amount of money we're spending right now on migrants in this country. Here's the thing that I find fascinating about this, which is that all of the people who are very angry and upset about the announcement of this policy, and yes, there'll be question marks about who it applies to, how you can do it, the legals of it, EU national, all of that. There's loads to work out and what the savings would be. I get that. But, we're years away from an election, so that, those things will come. But given that all these people have been telling us for years that migration is good, it's a net benefit to the country, migrants come here to work, they make a contribution, they're not claiming benefits, this is all a horrible, horrible lie, and complaining to every possible organisation they can if you ever make these claims, why are they so concerned about foreign nationals and migrants not being able to claim benefits in this country when apparently they're all net contributors and they're not claiming benefits? So surely it applies to zero migrants because they're all contributors. They can't have it both ways, can they?
No, absolutely, they can't have it both ways. And I think it's one of those things where, because so many of the arguments which were made in favour of the status quo, in favour of mass migration, have started to unravel, the Overton window on that question has shifted even amongst economists in a really fascinating way. So that's something which makes it increasingly difficult for them to push back. It's not to say that there aren't legitimate questions to be asked about this. I mean, everyone agrees in party politics that dealing with the question of the quote-unquote Boris wave, at its peak, 900,000 net,
that's net.
Absolutely. So moving towards the question of indefinite leave to remain, I mean, even Labour have, extended the period to 10 years because they're, recognised that fiscally that's a ticking time bomb as much as anything else. But there are broader questions. If you just kind of cancel the whole scheme overnight, not over a time-limited period, but across the piece, that's going to produce a lot of questions. What about Hong Kongers? What about Ukrainians? Also, what about people who may have been in the country for a long time, have British children?
Married to Brits.
Married to Brits. I mean, I think it wouldn't take many case studies and stories of people like that, someone's neighbour's wife, being put through the ringer, for people to start wondering if this is the best policy. But I think the question is that Reform are just making the political weather at the moment, and it's
and
very
as you say, they are changing
the
tone of the debate. They have pushed Labour's policy massively and Tory policy massively. So they're doing us a service just in that, and getting the mainstream, the big parties, back into some semblance, not there yet, but some semblance of reality.
Yeah.
And understanding where the British people are. I don't think they'll get all the way. I think Reform are very much leading the way there. But as you say, look, they say basically showdown with the EU. We're told over massive cuts he plans to welfare spending. They reckon some 430,000 non-EU citizens currently have indefinite leave to remain, but 4.12 million EU citizens have applied for settled status in the UK. 770,000 of whom are claiming universal benefits. Well, again, net contributors from the EU. But we have Brits who are claiming benefits in other European countries. The reality is that, of course, far more Europeans have come to Britain than Britons have gone to live and claim benefits in other countries.
Yeah, exactly.
It is a simple matter of fact because we don't all speak fluent something Polish and Romanian and Spanish and an awful lot of people do speak English, and we have lower requirement rules for a lot of that. But I mean, the Irish, I can't see how this applies remotely to the Irish. That they come under a law going back to
common travel area and all that.
Common travel area. I mean, again, Irish people are not, to all intents and purposes, foreigners. Irish nationals, I mean, South Republic of Ireland are not all, to all intents and purposes, in law, foreigners in this country, free movement, etc., regardless of the EU. EU, you've got to deal with the Brexit deal, the withdrawal agreement. You're going to have to unpick the whole of that, and it's not just that, France will stop letting people claim benefits or pensions or whatever. Brits in France. No, you're going to have to unpick the whole thing, and there will be reprisals. There will be trade reprisals going to as well. I'm not sure they're going to be able to unpick that. Spouses, again, as you say, that's an issue. But again, it's already an issue if you are a British person and you fall in love with someone overseas, getting them into the country. Numerous occasions where people, the Canadian partner who doesn't have a good enough job and you don't have a job that's... Seems to me that if you're born and bred in this country, if your partner speaks fluent English, that's an important thing. I'm not having people who've come here and then, I'm going to bring my wife from Pakistan or Bangladesh from some village where she doesn't speak a single word of the language and can make no contribution. No, sorry, I'm not entirely sure that's going to be a benefit to this country. But as you've got issues there. Hong Kong, they are from a British, it was a British territory. They have British passports. Won't apply to them, I'm sure. Ukrainians, the mums and the children, they were only supposed to be here on a temporary basis to escape the war, so I don't see why they should be eligible for it at all.
But even then, there might be some sort of special accommodation which needs to be out. And the fact that those questions couldn't be readily answered, I think, is a problem for them. And I
do wish parties would look at the questions. Find someone to ask you the questions in a practice press conference and then have the answers ready. Think it through before.
No, exactly. And I'm sure there has been a lot of thought that's gone into this, and the whole question of indefinite leave to remain has been one that's been hanging over the migration discussion for a long time, because of the fact that it kind of does blur the line between migrant workers on one side, applying for visas, coming here to do a job but not expecting much in return from the state, shall we say. You've then got the question of, full-blown British citizens, where there's rights and responsibilities in both directions, rightly so. And then you've got the indefinite leave to remain section. Now, of course, there's going to be a section of them who are, for all intents and purposes, sort of abusing the system, not integrating. Absolutely, that's a clear-cut problem. The issue that Reform are going to have to deal with, there's also going to be a lot of people in that category who, for all intents and purposes, are kind of British citizens in all but name. They are integrated, they do have family, they do have children, spouses, etc. And I think the reaction, whilst people are obviously concerned about migration, want it dealt with, I think they should take a bit of a lesson from what happened with Windrush, where, yes, people wanted a crackdown on illegal migration, but it leads to a situation where people who, even if they haven't got the right paperwork, are by anyone's justification a British citizen, someone who we owe support to. You saw support for that hostile environment policy, it was then called, drop off quite precipitously, even amongst older people who tend to be much more migration sceptical. So it's a tightrope, this issue, and I think that's one thing that, in the detail, hopefully we'll start to see these issues.
But in terms of the indefinite leave to remain, the idea that people, even if you've already got it, you'd have to reapply. So we're going to reapply, and then that should be part of the assessment. And again, the NHS and all the unions representing healthcare workers saying, "Oh, we're going to lose a load of people." Well, no, if you're doing a useful job and you're working, but again, here's the thing. It's great that we've got a load of people who come from India, the Philippines, wherever, to come and work as doctors and nurses in this country, but we make a political choice, not an economic choice, not to train up enough doctors and nurses in this country. There are thousands of young people who do their A-levels, they've got grade A's in sciences and maths, they're more than capable of doing a medical degree, and they're not able to because we limit the places, because it's 250 grand to train someone, and then we import people from abroad who then, of course, also need somewhere to live, or there are long costs related to that. We need to, we don't need to rely on foreign workers. I'm not anti-foreign, it's not xenophobia, it's just I would much rather that a young Brit was able to do the job that they desperately wanted to do in this country, and we didn't bother importing people. We don't need foreigners. In 20 years' time, we would not need to have foreigners propping up our vital health services, because we would be able to train up enough people ourselves. And I do think that we need to get back to the idea that we don't just rely on foreign workers to fill a lot of these roles.
And it's been in so many different sectors, public sector, private sector, there's been a desire to kind of plug gaps and to, in some cases at the lower end, to sustain very low wages. And at the higher end, because there isn't the pipeline of people being trained and not going through, whether it's medical school or getting the kind of technical skills that they would need to compete at that level. And so it becomes a kind of palliative. It covers up for those issues but leaves them there. The problem is that if you're going to be serious about this, there does need to be some kind of transition. There does need to be some kind of
you can't just do it overnight. We can't suddenly just have enough doctors. But here's the thing. I mean, this has been a sort of kind of a wink-wink deal between the government and big business and big employers, which, look, we'll get these people from over abroad, we don't have to train them up. Lovely job, they turn up. I mean, I've had this. People, you worked in restaurants and places like that, great, we've got a load of people who've got, university degrees and they're working as waiters here. They're really good at the job, great work ethic, turned up, brilliant. What's not to like, as opposed to some sort of school leaver? It's a Monday and it's raining, I'm not turning up. Well, of course they're employing the 26-year-old Polish, coffee maker. I mean, for goodness sake, it's not rocket science, but we need to have a complete change in attitude in this country in terms of work ethic, in terms of training, and in terms of employers, and doing their bit. But again, we need to help employers do their bit. They can't afford to take a lot of people on. They can't afford to take interns on, trainees on, because they're being squeezed on tax front. This involves such a sort of a mindset change in the whole country, and we need like a revolution. We need a revolution in parenting, in schools, in universities. Here's an idea: maybe some university academics bother turning up to work occasionally instead of doing everything on Zoom. To teach young people so they actually have the qualifications. I mean, our kids are already 2 or 3 years behind. Far East Asia students who turning up. I mean, come on. I mean, American students are a couple of years behind us, but that's nothing to crow about. We need to get our act together. But I mean,
whether or not that's correct, because we were talking there about people who maybe are coming from abroad and are they in high worth professions. There's a lot of professions which are very important, things like care work, which are paid terribly, and part of the reason that you do have to rely on foreign labour there is because. And somewhat understandably so. So there needs to be a kind of conversation across the piece as to
how much you pay. But that's local councils. They're funding a lot of the people in care works, in care homes, and they only get a certain amount of money from the government to do that. They haven't got the money. People don't want their council tax to go up. They don't want their other taxes to go up, but they want people to be looked after in care homes and people to be paid more money. You can't have it all ways, people. You can't have it all ways. That's the deal. Let's also talk about the big international news of the week, and this is the Palestinian state recognition. We had Macron grandstanding in his Cuban heels as usual, along with the Belgians at this meeting yesterday in New York ahead of a General Assembly meeting in New York. He formally recognised the Palestinian state. We had yesterday the raising of the Palestinian flag at their now embassy. I mean, no provisos, no conditions being put on Palestinian statehood, but absolutely 4 major conditions on Israel, which basically meant that guaranteed not a single hostage was going to be released and there wasn't going to be a ceasefire ahead of this. And then yesterday, Keir Starmer had the cheek to then wish peace, health and sweetness to the Jewish community in Britain, wishing them a happy Jewish New Year, Rosh Hashanah. I mean, just 24 hours after basically rewarding rewarding Palestinian statehood to Hamas, the terrorists who murdered, raped, mutilated, tortured, beaten, took hostage and are now starving still, dozens of people in Gaza. I mean, what an insult. The man, I mean, read the room, Starmer, read the room.
And that's one thing that maybe he doesn't quite recognise, but he really should, is that this recognition of Palestine has gone down like the proverbial cup of cold sick amongst the vast majority of British Jews. There's a whole spectrum of opinion amongst British Jews, amongst Jews, amongst Israelis full stop, about the war, about its government, about whether or not it should carry on, about also the kind of question of how you go forward with peace, although understandably so views have hardened significantly since October the 7th. And yet, to a man and woman, they've basically been at one with their shock and horror, apart from to be respectful to them, the relatively small number of very pro-Palestine, kind of anti-Zionist Jews who are knocking about. Everyone from the families of the hostages, either freed or remaining there, the British Board of Deputies, through to across the spectrum, there's been a kind of sense that you have just been obviously rewarding Hamas. I mean, the family of Emily Damari, the British Israeli hostage who was mercifully, thankfully returned not too long ago, said that this would be like awarding some territory to, the Nazi Party after the Holocaust. Exactly. I mean, it's one of those things where morally it's so clear cut, and they can bang on about the geostrategic importance of it and so on and so forth. We know that this was an electoral calculation. Even amongst people who would want to move towards a recognition of Palestine, the two-state solution should have held back for a long time, because of the fact it's a lever you can only pull once. And why are they pulling it now? It's for no other reason than the most base political motives, and we can all see that
the whole thing is just appalling. Well, yesterday on the show we spoke to the brother of Evia David. He's the hostage that was filmed, forced to dig his own grave for a propaganda video whilst emaciated, horrific. I mean, he's been kept in the most horrific conditions. Other hostages who've been released who were held with him, he was one of the hostages that was taken out in a car to watch other hostages being released while he was not going to. So taken out of the tunnels, seeing daylight, seeing the release, and then being taken back to the tunnels. He's been kept hands and feet chained, with a bag over his head a lot of the time, in a almost dark tunnel, clearly emaciated. I mean, starved, Belson-style levels of starvation. And we spoke to his brother, and he said, do you think this is going to bring peace, Keir Starmer? I mean, tell that to my mother. Tell that to my mother to her face. I mean, it's just so obscene. I'm beyond angry about this. I struggled all day yesterday not to say very, very bad four-letter words. But don't worry, Keir Starmer has demanded that the Palestinian Authority, that's run by Fatah, but by the way, in the West Bank, by the way, would definitely be defeated by Hamas if there were an election. Why? Because Hamas has delivered recognition of a Palestinian state. That's the reward they talk about. But he's demanded that the Palestinian Authority stops paying terrorists for killing Israelis. They literally have, it's not like something they do on the slide, they literally have a ministry that pays the martyrs who kill Israelis. I mean, that's literally what the government of the Palestinian Authority does. And those, by the way, are the so-called moderates.
And this is the president which Mahmoud Abbas visited Keir Starmer in London not only a couple of weeks ago. These are the supposed partners for peace. And this points to not only what a moral quagmire this is, but also how practically impossible it is. So whenever you get into these discussions, the Labour Party or whoever will kind of just naturally assume that the Palestinian Authority, led by Abbas, is the kind of the moderate in the room. And for the reasons you suggest, that's completely nonsense. But the Palestinian Authority also commands so little respect. They haven't had an election in, 2 decades because of the fact that they are fearful and know, basically, that they would lose it. The fact that you've got Hamas, who are not only obviously in control of Gaza, but increasingly popular across the West Bank, not least because of the fact that by dint of the way in which the West has reacted...
And not despite the massacre, because of the massacre.
It's vindicated their whole approach. And how could it not, given how everyone has responded? So it just shows morally, practically, what a nonsense this is. And depressingly, I do wonder if deep down he knows that this is just Britain kind of virtue signalling from the edges. If anything, it has made Britain more irrelevant to what happens next in that part of the world.
Made us more at risk is what I think it's done. Let's also talk about something else, because Donald Trump, he's going to speak at the UN this afternoon, and will no doubt raise this issue. He and, of course, the Israelis, very, very clear, didn't attend various events yesterday at the UN because of these announcements. But he did make an announcement yesterday, standing alongside his Health Secretary, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And he's urged pregnant women in America not to take paracetamol, claiming there's a link with autism. Now, this is something that RFK has talked an awful lot about. There is no proven. There have been some studies that suggest a correlation. They've not been able to establish a causation. Many other studies that have shown that is not the case. Bearing in mind, RFK is someone who's signed up to the whole MMR jabs, linked to autism. This is a complete lie spread by Andrew Wakefield. I mean, it's a lie, end of. Deliberate, known lie. He faked the research, absolute lie. And now they're pushing this. Now, basically, when you're pregnant, I mean, my God, you get told what you can and can't. I had a waiter once telling me, you shouldn't order smoked salmon. It's like, a little less medical advice from you and a little more bringing of the food will work out better for your tip, mate. A lot of people don't have a clue what you can and can't take. You are allowed to take paracetamol, but you shouldn't take it unless absolutely necessary. If you've got a fever, you should just randomly take drugs of any kind when you're pregnant. But this is worrying, because this is supposed to be put out as the explanation for why we've got this rise in autism, when the rise in autism is clearly, obviously based on the much broader definition of what autism is. And there's been no rise, by the way, in the most severe cases of autism. That's a giveaway, that it's just a wider definition, but also increased diagnosis, increased awareness of it. And yet this lie is being put out, and this by I'm sorry, but Donald Trump is the man who did suggest that drinking disinfectant, i.e. bleach, could cure you of COVID. I mean, for goodness sake, this is not science. No,
not at all. And it's one of those things where obviously Donald Trump has played pretty fast and loose with medical science in his own way. RFK Jr., as you say, is someone who is not only kind of anti-vax and not just COVID vax, but ones that have been established for a very long time, despite these lies that were put in them, MMR and so on. But kind of conspiratorial as well. Like, he's an interesting character, RFK Jr. I can understand why a lot of people kind of rallied to his campaign when he ran for president.
I mean, calling out Big Pharma, Big Pharma does lie all the time and shouldn't be trusted.
You can be a little bit right.
I've got no issue with that.
You can be a little bit right and also very, very wrong at the same time, and I think that's RFK Jr. on a lot of these questions. As you say, there's just not the evidence for it. Now, of course, I understand and lament the fact that particularly how the medical and scientific establishment and Big Pharma have carried on over the course of the past 5 years, COVID in particular, has shattered a lot of people's trust. But there's a difference between scepticism and cynicism, and I think sometimes we're slipping into the latter.
But the medical establishment, they say, people don't trust us anymore. Well, okay, and there's a lot of distrust over MMR, and again, there was just clearly just a grifter, genuinely telling lies. But people look, but I know somebody, there's always that. But I mean, if the medical authorities and the scientific establishment, and even I asked, bodies like the MHRA and people like that, if they had not lied to us repeatedly, chief scientific officer, chief medical advisor, they told lies. They told absolute lie. Now, if you go back to what they said in March 2020, they were actually telling us the truth before we did the lockdown. But when they told lies about, the efficacy of masks, no, there's no evidence whatsoever that masks prevent spreading the disease or you getting the disease. They told us that children should be jabbed and young people. Absolutely not. The risk benefit analysis, very, very clear, and the scientific establishment established that and then backed down on it with no new evidence. A load of what they did in schools, again, no evidence for any of it at all. The arguments about pregnant women not taking the jab, some big question marks there, telling us that the jabs would they prevent spreading of the disease, spreading of COVID. There had been no evidence for that whatsoever, and basically the main reason I took the jab, even though I'd had COVID already, because I had elderly parents who were a bit unwell, and I thought it was a responsible thing to do. They told lots of lies. You can't tell a load of lies that have no evidence whatsoever behind them, no scientific evidence at all, and then say, oh, but you should believe us now. They have brought this on themselves. The trouble is, when it comes to things like people not getting MMR for their kids and other jabs that people aren't getting for their kids, vital childhood jabs which save lives, we are going to see children getting seriously ill and children dying because of that. Yeah. And that is unforgivable.
It is absolutely, and that's something that we need to bear in mind here. I think the thing is that you don't want to flip from one set of people pushing nonsense to another set of people pushing nonsense.
Exactly, completely.